Yeah, anything from chapter 2.
ERA.
ERA. What was ERA?
Equal rights of
Equal Rights Amendment, yes. And what was Equal Rights Amendment? What did I give you that as an example of? Oh. I had given...
faith and,
Go ahead.
full faith and credit.
No, it was not full faith and credit. If you go back and you look, I had given you Equal Rights Amendment as an example of, I believe it was original intent. Let me take a look and make sure that I've got this right. Because Equal Rights Amendment was designed to ban discrimination on account of sex or gender. And you'll notice up here, here it is, original intent. And right under original intent, there's ERA as far as interpreting the Constitution. And I had mentioned this to y'all because we had brought it up, and basically the idea was that women were basically not having the same opportunities at jobs, and when they got jobs, they surely were not being paid the same. So the point or the thought process was that if the Equal Rights Amendment were added to the Constitution, then in fact the government would be able to step in and basically stop this discrimination. They could order more equitable pay, and they would have the appropriate means to be able to get involved. Yes?
More equitable pay for man and woman?
Yes. Yes. But what was the problem? What else could Equal Rights Amendment, had it been passed, actually have created? Go ahead.
The gay marriage.
The gay marriage thing, yeah. And if you go back and you look at this, if you remember, if you just were looking at original intent of the framers, I don't know that anybody really talked about gay rights when you consider the idea of original intent of the framers for the Equal Rights Amendment. But if a man and a woman can get married anywhere in the country and then move somewhere else in the country and still be married, but you go back even a few years ago, a man and a man or a woman and a woman attempted to get married, A, odds are they weren't going to be able to get married in most states, and B, if they moved to a different state, they sure weren't going to be able to take that marriage with them. The original intent actually would not have covered that. But just the words of the amendment that basically, if you remember, says, not allowing discrimination on account of gender or sex, well, effectively, this could have created the right to gay marriage with a semi-clever lawyer arguing a semi-prepared case. So kind of keep that one in mind. Polygamy is not legal, and do you remember how they came up with using original intent to say that polygamy would not be legal?
Then the Mormon was created after they passed the law.
The Mormons, it did involve the Mormons. Well, how did the court use original intent? Go ahead.
The Church of Latter-day Saints did not exist during the time of the...
That's what they said. When they drafted the Constitution, the Mormons were not here, which meant they did not anticipate protecting that kind of a practice. You could argue that considering a lot of other religions are practiced today that were not available back then, you could argue that this case maybe needs to get revisited. Maybe this should be upheld as being legal. What other questions have y'all got, I guess, from the study terms? Chapter 2.
Preamble.
What was the preamble?
The articles of the Constitution.
Okay, I heard the articles, I've heard the establishment clause. What was the preamble?
The preamble is has no legal significance.
That's right. The preamble is the introduction to the Constitution. And I think I had mentioned this to y'all within the context of, okay, the preamble is like the introduction to your paper. You tell them what you're going to tell them. The preamble is the introduction to the Constitution. Sometimes people, and Doug, I heard you before when talk about the Declaration of Independence, you had said, we the people. We the people is actually the Constitution, so be careful with that, not to get those confused. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness comes from the Declaration. We the people is more from the Constitution. Well, it is from the Constitution, but for our purposes, it mentions a number of things in there. Secure the blessings of liberty, provide for the common defense. People have sued because they felt like the government wasn't doing this, and the court has thrown this out. And Martha, to your point, the preamble has no legal significance whatsoever. It's just considered an introduction. What else do y'all have from chapter 2? Stare decisis. Yeah, this has come up a few times. Stare decisis, if you remember, is Latin, and it means literally let the decision stand. And the idea is, behind stare decisis, that if the court, especially the Supreme Court, has issued a ruling about an issue, if that issue comes back before the Supreme Court, then they are supposed to use the logic that the court used in their earlier decision. So you keep allowing earlier cases to decide the later ones. Now, with this in mind, I gave you 2 examples of stare decisis. Do y'all remember what they were? Roe versus Wade was one. And what did I say about Roe?
It's not gonna be like you talk about the roots, like the farther away we come away from it, the chance will be like repealed.
The lesser chance it will ever be overturned. Roe versus Wade has been going for like 4 decades now. And I'd given you the example of the tree. If you planted a tree over the weekend, could you pull it out of the ground today? Yeah, you could. If you planted a tree a month ago, could you pull it out of the ground today? Yeah, you probably could. If you planted a tree 40 years ago, are you going to be able to pull it out of the ground? No, because, I mean, the roots are going to have gone so deep and the tree is going to have grown so high. Roe is kind of like that tree. The longer that a case remains valid, the less likely it's ever going to be overturned. Go ahead.
They didn't Plessy versus Ferguson stand for like 57 years.
Yeah, and let's not get into that since we're just reviewing, because I don't wanna like confuse people, because you're right, and we'll get to Plessy, I promise. But the idea is that the longer that it's there, the less likely it's ever going to be overturned. It's not to say it'll never happen, but it's much, much less likely. What was the example that I gave you that was overturned? Like a year later.
Oh, the West Virginia. What was West?
What was the West Virginia? Standing for the flag salute, yes. The Jehovah's Witness kids would not stand for the flag, if you remember, in West Virginia. What was their denomination?
Jehovah's Witnesses.
They were Jehovah's Witnesses, and Jehovah's Witnesses do not pledge allegiance effectively to worldly bodies. So pledging allegiance to the flag or the United States government, that would be a worldly body. This was a religious kind of a protest, if you will. Go ahead.
What was the name of the actual case?
Oh, don't worry about that for our purposes now. So as we go through this, anything else you can tell me from that case? Did they win? Did they lose? What happened?
Oh, they won
They lost
They
initially.
lost, but
They lost, but then it was overturned. What did the court say? Because the kids said, this is our religion. The kids said, not only is this our religion, but you know, we don't want to violate our First Amendment rights, and this, you know, pledging allegiance to a worldly body would do that. What was the argument of the school for making them stand?
that it doesn't affect the First Amendment.
It what?
That it doesn't affect.
What were they trying to do by making them stand if it wasn't to impose religion?
That, disrespect.
They were trying to impose disrespect.
No,
Patriotism, what else?
Like they have like
If some other students see they can do something
it was
else.
during the Red Scare, so like it had to do with the whole like you don't stand for the flag, therefore you're against it, therefore you're communist sort of.
This actually goes back to the Cold War time, you're right on this. And they were trying to demonstrate patriotism. The flag is supposed to be a sacred symbol, you know, these kinds of things. And they were also basically trying to demonstrate respect and raise good citizens to be loyal to the cause. The court, when they ruled in favor of the school, bought this. But what happened to the kids?
They
What's
won't-
that, Tony?
They got bullied.
Tarred and feathered. They got beaten up. Anything else?
Frustrated.
Yeah, somebody got castrated too. So these little kids that were 9, 10, 11 years old, they weren't that old, started getting West Virginia justice, if you will. And in fact, the Supreme Court caught 10 kinds of hell because this decision kind of imposed this on those little kids. A year later, basically, on Flag Day, a similar case came before the Supreme Court and they overruled this. And again, it's the idea that, you know, if you get something, get it early, because the longer that it stays valid law, the less likely it's ever going to be overturned. What other kind of questions have y'all got from up here?
You said Roe versus Wade was about what?
Roe versus Wade was an example of stare decisis that has not been overturned, and when we talked about it in class, it's not likely to be overturned because it's been around so long. What else? Go ahead, Rob.
Dependent fractions.
There were a lot of fractions that we talked about. What are some of the fractions that we talked about?
3/5.
3/5. What did 3/5 deal with?
For every 45 slaves, 3 of them counted for
Say what now?
Alright, so for every 5 slave owners.
I think 3/5 is.
Yeah.
Wasn't it,
3/5 of the slave population counted for.
A slave was only worth 3/5 of a
Yeah, yeah.
person. So 5 slaves equals 3/5, or pardon me, 5 slaves equals 3 people. Why was this important? Why did they use this fraction to figure out?
Wasn't it, to see how many representatives of the state got?
For representatives for the state in the House of Representatives and, go ahead.
I think because the southern state had more
Tax.
slaves, so they didn't want, the northern state didn't want the southern state to have more representation.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. The southern states had more slaves, so that in fact the northern states didn't want them to have more representation or too much representation. What did you say, Charlie?
Tax.
Taxes. It was used to determine representation in the Congress, and it was also used to determine taxes. So basically, the northern states got the southern states to have to pay more taxes. The southern states got more representation in the House of Representatives. What other fractions do we have? 3/5 is one. Go ahead.
I have a question.
Oh, let's deal with the fractions first. Go ahead.
9/13.
What was 9/13?
You had to get 9 states out of 13 to ratify
Ratify what?
amendments.
State.
No.
9 state.
9 of the 13 states to ratify what? When did we have 13 states?
13 colonies. Well,
9/13 actually falls under the ratification of the original Constitution. They required 9 of the 13 states to ratify. Why did they pick 9?
it's just barely over. Well, it's like.
In order to pass a law before the Constitution, what did it have to be? Had to be unanimous. It had to be 13 out of 13. So why did they pick 9 when the rule was 13 out of 13? Oh, it's going to be a bad test because they knew they actually had 9 states. Don't you remember when I went through the chart and it talked about some states passed it unanimously, but Rhode Island and New York and some of these other places were just a couple of votes off? Make sure that you take a good look at that piece of it. 3/4. What does 3/4 deal with?
Voting,
What kind of voting?
like the majority
3.
Okay, the voting majority for what?
for the electoral.
To pass a law in Congress.
Oh, this is gonna be a bad test. I'm starting to feel bad about this. On page 32, and we went through this, talking about ratifying amendments. You need a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress to propose. You need a 3/4 vote of the states in order to ratify. So there was 2/3, 3/4, 3/5, 9/13, and 13/13. And what else did 2/3 deal with? Something that we would have just gone over. What else did 2/3 do? Oh, it's going to be a bad test. 2/3 dealt with overriding a presidential veto. So keep that in mind. Those are the fractions. Jordan, what question did you have?
First, what page?
That page was 32.
I forgot.
Okay, what other questions do y'all have from the terms or articles or whatever?
The Virginia plan and the New Jersey.
What was the difference between Virginia and New Jersey?
New Jersey wanted, equal representation.
Yeah, they did. And what did that plan become?
The Senate.
Came to Senate. Yes, go ahead.
The Virginia plan, they wanted, representation based on the amount of people they had in each state.
Or wealth. Go ahead, yeah.
And which became the House of Representatives.
And that became the House of Representatives. The Virginia plan basically was saying, if I have more people or if I have more wealth, then I should have a bigger voice in the government. The New Jersey plan was the smaller state plan, and their argument was, if it shouldn't matter how much you have, or want money or wealth or people or whatever, but it should be based on all the states have the exact same voice. The big states wanted to have more control of the government with Virginia. The small states wanted to have a little bit too much control, you could argue, based upon equality. And then it was the Connecticut Compromise that put both of them together. Virginia became the House and New Jersey became the Senate. And in order for a bill to become a law, it's got to pass both of them. Go ahead.
So now